Can everyone see my screen? Great. Awesome. All right. So today we're going to continue off of what we were learning yesterday. So this is UI patterns part 2. And I gave a little bit of a snapshot of what we'll be discussing today in Slack, but we'll primarily be focused on how do we design a content management system, how do we design a client relation management system, and then towards the end of class, we'll also go into designing a mobile application. And just to give a heads up, the assignment for this afternoon is going to be a way for you to be able to build a hybrid between a content management system and a client relation management system. So just in case you have any questions during lecture related to those two systems, feel free to unmute yourself or ask in Slido, so that way we can really set you up for success for today's assignment. All right, so what exactly is a content management system? And so we may have heard this terminology before, and we may have heard it called its full name, but it can also be called a CMS. And within the last couple of weeks, we've really focused on thinking about how do we design for our customers, for our users. But we should also take a step back and think from a back-end perspective. How do we design experiences so that we're able to present our content to our users? And so a content management system is going to allow a business to organize, manage, and publish their content. And if you think of some examples that are out there today, you may have already interacted with a CMS platform, whether it's Medium when you're writing your posts, whether it's WordPress, you're creating that content and then you're able to publish it so that your visitors are able to see that. And we talked a lot about the CRUD pattern yesterday. So CMSs are going to typically follow that CRUD pattern. But in short, just remember that a CMS is going to allow you to control and manage your content within your website. As I mentioned earlier, we really think about the back-end perspective of a website. So these CMS platforms that you see or will maybe design for at one point in time are rarely going to be customer-facing. So these are tools, these are internal tools that businesses will be able to use in order to manage the content that the customers consume in other parts of the user experience. And in most cases, the CMS can feel like an afterthought. It's really easy to disregard it because it's something that our customers don't see. But a CMS platform is something that we really need to be mindful of as we use it for our products, because it can have a really dramatic effect on our overall UX. So an example of this is, think about typos. Think about what you would need to do in order to fix a typo in a CMS platform. And if you have a poorly designed CMS, this could take several steps in order to fix that typo. And then if we think about it from a long-term perspective, what if we just have so many typos? It's going to require a lot of frequent content changes. And so as you can see, the CMS system, not taking into consideration its UX, could end up becoming a nightmare. And maybe even further down the line, you may even have people on your team who are less likely to use it, less likely to update the content just because it's so cumbersome and it's not very intuitive to use. So let's move over to what are some of those CMS common patterns. And typically in CMS platforms, depending on what you're using, whether you're, like I said earlier, you're using Medium, WordPress, Squarespace is also CMS, they're going to vary a bit between one CMS platform to another, but there are some common patterns that we can apply to each CMS. So the first I kind of already touched on, which is they're all going to follow this CRUD pattern. So thinking of Medium, thinking of that as a blog, for example, we need the ability to be able to create a blog, read a blog, update a blog, and delete it. And then this pattern is going to get repeated for each piece of blog content that gets produced in the content management system. And then another pattern with CMS is that content is often going to be related to one another. For example, if you're writing a blog post, they might have specific topic tags, and these relationships are also important to highlight within a CMS. In the create and update sections, there are typically ways to add and remove these relationships, while in the read section, we can see the various relationships and navigate to the read pages to see more details about them. And then the last piece to this is, in addition to making sure that you're managing your required content, CMS also have ways to manage their meta content, their assets, their images. And so a lot of UX friction stems from implementing these features in a way that supports the database instead of your user's workflow. So we really need to make sure that we're paying attention to how our users are incorporating these details into the content and design of their CMS. Okay, so let's switch gears here and take a look at a couple of different CMS platforms. And the first that I'll bring up is we can take a look at WordPress. So WordPress actually has a demo that you can take a look at. Let me go ahead and share this so that way if you're interested in taking a peek while I'm going through it, you'll be able to see that as well. So if you go here, you'll be able to view a WordPress demo, and you can also view it from an admin's perspective. So let's just click into here, log in, and the passwords are listed here in case you do want to follow along. All right, so this is an example of a CMS system that a company might be using. And on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of information, a bunch of features that the user can participate in. So thinking about post, we can go in here. Looks like there's already a couple of different examples, but we can monitor all the posts that we've written. So let's go to this one in particular. And so I'm able to go ahead and edit my post. On the right-hand side, obviously there's certain formatting features that I can use. And then there's also a category section. So if I wanted to create a new category for whichever content this is relatable to, I'd be able to do so. And then we talked a little bit about tags. So tags is another way to identify what your content is about. So maybe, let's see if I can add something about dogs. Great. So if somebody were to search for my content and they use the tag dogs, they would be able to find this information here. And then once I've written a few things, let's see if this works. Just gonna write test. I can go into this link here, and what I wrote didn't quite work, but what we see here is now this is the customer-facing view. We've written our content. Let me see if I can actually just show both. We've written our content here, and now all the content that we've written is going to appear on this live page that visitors will see. So this is another example of a CMS. Also, there's a media component where we can go in and add assets to here, and so forth. Okay. All right, so let's move on to one more piece about CMS, and then I will go ahead and take questions related to that. Okay. Okay, so Because there are so many businesses that rely on a CMS, there are some companies who either choose to develop their own CMS platforms, or they'll take something that's off the shelf. And so off the shelf is going to be WordPress is going to be an example of off the shelf. It's already been built. A business would be able to take that and incorporate it into their business. So other examples that are off the shelf, aside from WordPress, they include Drupal, Joomla, Contentful, and we can see that it's kind of think of it as QuickBooks, for example. It's a way for you to be able to get what you need, but it's already been built for you so that you can go ahead and efficiently use it. So there are many industries that require specialized CMS to manage their specific context. For example, if you work with any educational institutions, they may rely on something called a learning management system, or also known as an LMS, which is basically another version of a CMS, but it's specifically targeted for educational users. And even though your company, let's say, may use an off-the-shelf solution, it may seem like we really don't need to take the time to design anything for these off-the-shelf CMS solutions, but we can definitely make sure that we're placing an effort in improving the core user experience by helping our developers customize these off-the-shelf CMS platforms in order to make sure that our team's workflow and content needs are met. And then on the flip side, in regards to building out a custom CMS, there are companies who choose to go ahead and do so. Maybe perhaps some of the off-the-shelf CMS platforms don't exactly meet their needs. Maybe they need something that's a little bit more specific to their features. But it's something that, there's pros and cons to both. So if you're working with a company that decides to build their own custom CMS, they may be encountering additional costs in order to build it. There might be a longer timeline in order to build it out. So overall, perhaps maybe even more upfront costs. But then if you do choose to go with an off-the-shelf CMS, that might be a little bit easier just because it's probably going to be cheaper than building your own CMS. You'll be able to edit content without writing any sort of code, and it's typically pretty quick to deploy. Okay, so what questions do we have about CMS before we start talking about how do we design for one?
Did you have to work with these a bit in your experience?
Yeah, very little. So normally we had a content team that would work with the CMS. At Verizon, we use something called Adobe Experience Manager. I only interfaced with it a little bit when it came to writing copy. I just wanted to make sure that what I was putting in Adobe Experience Manager and what it was outputting actually made sense, and it didn't seem like very cluttered. So that is one example of where I use CMS. But other than that, I haven't actually designed one. It's just been off-the-shelf CMS that I've worked with. What else? Question Slido, examples for custom CMS. That is a really good question. So I don't have any examples for custom CMS, only because I'm not quite sure what companies are using or what they are doing. I know for Lambda, everything that you see in Training Kit, it is not a custom CMS. We are using Airtable in order to present all that information. So we're using an off-the-shelf CMS platform in order to do so.
Yeah, there's literally thousands of templates for WordPress online.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot. And maybe some of you may have worked with companies where they had their own custom CMS. So if you have any examples too, feel free to share. Okay, next question. If off the shelf is easier and quicker, why would someone use custom? That is a really good question. It's going to depend on your business needs. Perhaps maybe they've evaluated WordPress and they've evaluated Drupal and Joomla and all these other off-the-shelf CMS systems, and they may not quite address what they're looking for. So just like how educational institutions may rely on something called a learning management system, you may have other businesses that are probably maybe perhaps very unique in what they do, and that they just need more features in order to be able to customize the content that they present to their customers. To clarify, is CMS a ready-made platform like Squarespace or WordPress, where you can just go in and post content without coding? Absolutely. So that's a really great way of describing it. It's being able to post content without coding. So yes, even I can show an example of Squarespace because that's something that I use. But even Squarespace is going to be an example of a CMS platform. So here, this is actually my portfolio that I have up here. But if I go into trying to create, right now, this is one of my case studies, but this is a CMS platform. I can go in and I can adjust all the content that we see here. So I can go in and edit my text. I can go in and add specific blocks, images, so that once I publish this, this is practically what the user is going to see or a visitor is going to see. And another question, would you use custom CMS if you were trying to show your coding skills? I would say you, not necessarily. So having a custom CMS is really more of a business decision and less of being able to show your coding skills. But if they were a business that decided to move forward with a custom CMS, I wouldn't necessarily say that's about showing off your coding skills, but they may require hiring folks that are going to be skilled in being able to build that platform. So I hope I was able to answer that question for you. Great. Okay, great questions, everyone. Let's continue to move on and really talk about what it takes to design a CMS in the event that you may have to build one. And if not, this is just good practice in understanding the thought process behind a CMS. And because it is using this CRUD pattern, you'll be able to apply it to anything that's similar in nature. All right, so when it comes to designing a CMS, it's going to be very similar as to taking on any other design project that we would work on. But there's a few things that we just need to take into consideration. Oops. Okay, so the first piece is it's going to be content driven. So when you're designing a CMS, you really need to have a content first mentality. And it's no surprise that a CMS should be driven by its content and how users interact with it. But you'd be surprised how often these projects get taken over by engineering trying to replicate the database. So in order to design an effective CMS, you need to be able to understand what content will be managed by it, what details each piece of content needs to include, and how your users are currently managing it. And then the second piece is our CRUD pattern. So again, we've been talking about CRUD a lot lately these last 2 days, but the CMS platform is going to follow this CRUD pattern. So once you've identified the content that you'll be using in your CMS and that you'll be managing, you'll need to make sure that the CMS follows this create, read, update, and delete feature or functionality. And then user roles. So we also talked about this yesterday. User roles are going to be very important to take into consideration when you're building out a CMS. For example, it might seem like everyone should have edit capabilities, being that it's an internal tool, but the different types of user roles need to be well considered. For example, thinking through who's going to have permission in order to delete content or edit content. Where might there be a specification where users will only have the access to read the content that's available? So making sure that you have that defined is going to help you build out a successful CMS. And then the last piece to this is talking about flexibility versus rigidity. And so you'll see if you demo a couple of different CMS platforms, you'll see that some of them are pretty flexible, where we offer a bunch of features to your users in order to be able to do things like add content, delete them, style them. But then there are perhaps other CMS systems that are a little bit more rigid. So rigid meaning they're limiting a user's choice in terms of what they can do with their content. And that might be another reason as to why some businesses look into custom CMS platforms. So there's definitely pros and cons to either having a flexible or rigid CMS system. But flexible systems are going to allow for a high degree of customization and edge case handling, while the rigid systems are going to be more consistent and easier to interpret. So when you're designing a CMS, you don't have to formally pick one approach over the other. Instead, just recognize that your CMS will operate on the spectrum, flexibility versus rigidity. And so you'll need to consider which approach is most appropriate for your users. Oh, and there's one more. So last but not least, support. This is also really important. Some of the CMS platforms that I was actually taking a look at earlier when I was viewing their demo sites, sometimes they were actually designed without having the user in mind. So it might be a little bit tougher to understand how to use the tool. So when we're designing a CMS, we really need to keep in mind what happens from a support perspective. And that entails making sure that we're able to train new users on how they can use their CMS, and then be able to also keep existing users familiar with infrequently used workflows. So incorporating things like contextual help, field explanations, accurate support documentation will really go a long way towards improving the overall experience of your CMS, because it's going to empower your user to master the system. So what questions do we have on designing a CMS?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a question. In terms of designing the CMS, I noticed in CMS platforms like WordPress, there's a front end and there's also a back end. And my question is it up to the designer to pay attention to both parts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So maybe let's assume your company is using WordPress right now as part of their product, as part of their CMS. I will say, from my experience, I've paid attention more so to the front end, just because that was more top of mind of what users would see. But there were times that I did pay attention to the back end, only because I wanted to make sure that that it was easy to set up. I've run into instances where I would ask to request a copy update, and it was just so convoluted and the fields didn't make any sense, and I don't think it was really customized to fit our needs, that it took a really long time, perhaps maybe even a week, to get copy change updates. So I would say that, yes, pay attention to the front end, but if you can, work with somebody to also pay attention to the back end, so that way your work streams can go a lot quicker. Good question. Anything else?
How easy is to design a CMS or customize a CMS? This customize the design.
Yeah. So are we talking about maybe creating our own, or yeah, okay. So I will say I have not had an opportunity to create my own CMS. I know Nick Basil, one of the other instructors on the team, he has had experience. He's on paternity leave right now, but he should be back if you ever want to chat with him. But from my understanding is that there's a lot of work. So think of it as if you were to design any other product. Not only are you paying attention to what would happen from a front end, meaning what the customers are going to see, but you're also thinking about your own internal employees and making sure that what you're building out for them is going to be easy and intuitive. So that in itself is its own round of research and testing and making sure that things are working and testing it even before it goes out live to make sure, again, that it's an intuitive experience. So it is a lot of work, but I would imagine that you would be working with a group of people in order to flesh out the experience. And that goes for any product. There's so much thought that goes into it. Even when we were looking at the interaction patterns the other day, it was like, wow, I didn't think that the button could do this, or I didn't think the screen could do X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of little things that go into it. So it's all about really focusing on the research and discovery piece, and then being able to build out your experience through there. Awesome. All right, so let us switch gears. And we've talked a lot about CMS, content management systems, and let's talk about client relation management systems. So these CRM tools. So what is a client relation management? And some of you may be familiar with the term CRM, but this is going to be a system used by businesses in order to organize and keep track of their clients, customers, and sales. So think of it as a system where users get real-time data about their clients. In my case, or if anyone has ever worked in a sales position, there may have been a CRM tool that you've used in order to keep track of your clients and making sure that you understand who they are before you even reach out to them. That's going to be an example of a CRM tool. And while the CRM tool is going to, or the CRM system is going to follow the CRUD pattern for managing data, they will also include additional information, for example, dashboards and analytics, so that businesses can really gauge the success of their sales efforts. And CRMs, their typical user, even though they can really be used by any type of business stakeholder, they're going to be heavily used by sales and marketing teams just because it's really strongly aligned with their roles. All right, so we already went over this. CRM allows a business to organize, keep track of their clients, customers, and sales. All right, so let's talk about some CRM common patterns. And some of this is going to overlap with what we talked about related to CMS. But a CRM tool is going to be incredibly important just because its operational software is going to be able to help people, helps businesses manage and uncover insights about the people who are paying money for their products. So being able to improve upon its user experience can help our businesses keep making money. Therefore, designing an effective CRM experience have outsized impacts on your business's performance. And so when it comes to designing a CRM system, there's going to be some sort of variation in comparison to a CMS, but just because that they're designed to support their business's specific customer relations and sales pipelines. But again, there are some common patterns that we can look into in order for us to be able to leverage that external consistency. And I realized I hadn't given an example early on. So yes, someone had commented in Slido, would a CRM tool be something like Salesforce? Absolutely. So we can take a look at that in just a bit. But Salesforce is a really popular tool that folks are using as a CRM platform. Okay. All right, so let's just dive into some of these patterns here. Again, CRM systems are going to follow this CRUD pattern. So for example, if you're managing clients, you'll have to be able to create a way to add your clients, to be able to read your client's data. If there's any sort of communication that you've had with your client, you'd be able to want to update it. And if that client is no longer someone that's supporting your business, perhaps you want to be able to either delete or archive that specific client. And then the next pattern, again, pretty similar to CMS, but oftentimes data is also going to be related to each other. So for example, if you have a customer that's made many purchases, this is something that is going to be important to highlight within a CRM system. In the create and update sections, there are typically ways to add and remove these relationships. While in the read section, we can see the various relationships and navigate to the read pages to see more details about them. Oops, let me go back here. And then last but not least, in order for businesses to be able to manage their data, like I mentioned earlier, CRMs, they might also include dashboards and analytics so that they can go in and measure performance and uncover insights. So sometimes you'll have business stakeholders who are going to request to have certain type of information that they'd like to see in the CRM, but this type of information is going to be helpful for them so that they are able to obtain their business goals. And we want to make sure that we are being mindful of what their goals are so that we can design for those specific dashboards and analytics that would meet certain metrics. So let's hop over to Salesforce. I do not have a Salesforce account, but I was able to view almost like not an onboarding flow, but almost an example of what their system looks like. I'm not quite sure if you all will be able to access this, but I'm going to share this just in case you can. I kind of had to jump through hoops to fill out a form in order to see this. So see if that works. But if not, we can all take a look at this screen here. And so we have Salesforce. And so in this example, it appears that we have all of our customer information. So we have the account name, the industry, their phone number. And then on top of that, thinking back to the dashboard analytics, we have these visualizations here. So we can see the different types of accounts that Salesforce has in their database according to industry. And then if we were to click into one of these different account names, we would be able to see more information about that particular client. I know this is kind of in the way, but unfortunately I can't remove it. But here, if you can see, we have extra information about who they are and also additional information about related contacts. Perhaps there's even business opportunities. And then looks like there's some additional features here, being able to contact certain clients And then especially working as a sales position, it's really important to be able to track the conversations that you've had with that particular person. So here they have some sort of a tracking method to easily find when was the last communication that had occurred with this specific client. So question in Slido, does Salesforce automatically keep track of customer data, or do salespeople have to enter data manually? That is a good question. I'm pretty sure you have to go in manually to add in the information. I'm just thinking back to when I was working in sales in the stores. Whenever I had made a contact with somebody, I would go in and manually add it. But then it was basically a sales funnel. So if they were able to review accounts that were available to upgrade their phones, for example, that information would actually get populated. That's not something that I would have to manually add in. So I actually think it's a combination of both. And then, so CRM is more for the stakeholders and data analysts. I would say CRM is going to be not only for your stakeholders and your data analysts that you've just mentioned, but also for your sales folks. So even though a business stakeholder will be able to go in and pull data immediately from a dashboard and see where the company or the team is at a high level, this is also a really awesome tracking tool for sales folks in order to view when they last communicated with someone, perhaps maybe even the products that they've purchased or the revenue that they've made off of that individual.
Hey, Melissa.
Yeah.
When I was working at Career Builder, we actually used Salesforce for troubleshooting and talking with the sales reps. So it was integrated through Career Builder itself, the system, and it was also integrated through an email. So if they wanted us to troubleshoot something for a client, like if a job was mapped incorrectly or if there was something wrong with Talent Network, then we would communicate through Salesforce basically. And we would actually track let's say the issue or the client themselves, like the employee's location, with a unique identifier as well with Salesforce.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So yours was less salesy and more troubleshooting oriented. And where you
both, because
would say both?
that in other people in other departments like project managers and other different people in management teams use it as well.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I could see that from a long-term strategy, just being able to keep all of your customer information in just one system. And that way, if let's say, Carrie, if you were no longer there, but somebody on your team was working with that specific person with a troubleshooting issue, they'd be able to continue on and be able to read all that past history in order to help them. Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Question in Slido, how is Salesforce able to populate information? How are they able to suggest business opportunities? That is a really good question. So when I was in sales, I didn't see that part of that system. I think that's something that is really handled by the developers and possibly the people in operations that would handle the back and forth. I'm sure there's some sort of importing data. I'm not sure, maybe there's some real-time data that's happening so that they can constantly make sure that they have the most relevant information in the dashboard. So being able to populate information, that's, again, a conversation that you would have to have with your developers, but you don't really need to technically know how to do that. You just need to make sure that they're able to pull the information that you need. Great questions. Anything else that I can help answer about the CRM tools? Awesome. All right. Let's move on over to talking about off-the-shelf versus custom CRM. So similar to a CMS system, there are going to be some businesses who find that off-the-shelf solutions like Salesforce may not necessarily address their needs. Maybe they need something a little bit more specific that Salesforce isn't able to offer to them, so that they decide to build their own. But when it comes to off-the-shelf CRM systems, we've just looked at Salesforce, which is a really good example. And other examples that other businesses may use could be Zoho CRM or Sugar CRM, and there's a whole list of others that are available. So again, even though similar to thinking about a CMS system, even though we don't necessarily have to design for an off-the-shelf solution, we still want to just be mindful of how it works, because this is ultimately going to impact our workflow and impact what our users are going to see from a front-end perspective. And the pros and cons that we've gone over are, again, going to overlap with CMS. So off the shelf, it's typically going to perhaps be cheaper to build. I mean, they already have an infrastructure in place. For example, Salesforce probably already has their own support team that employees can reach out to if there's any sort of trouble. But many companies opt to build their own CRM because they might not have enough data to require a full-blown off-the-shelf solution. They might believe that it's cheaper for them to build it themselves. Perhaps maybe it's has to do with data. They want to be able to retain ownership of their data, or perhaps they want to have some sort of specialized analytics set up for their business stakeholders to view. And I hope I was able to answer that question in Slido about other sales CRMs. So just to repeat those again, we have Zoho CRM and we have Sugar CRM. Okay, so let's talk about how do we design for one. And again, there's going to be some similar overlaps, but thinking about designing for a CRM system is going to be very similar to how we tackle any sort of design project. So we definitely want to make sure that it's data-driven. So similar to CMS, we wanted that to be more content-driven, but for CRM, we want it to be more data-driven. So in Carrie's example, if you're troubleshooting someone's equipment, how do we make sure that we have the right data that's provided to us? Or what if we've been working with a client where we've been trying to sell 50 phones to their business? What kind of data will we need that we could extract as to who that client is and why they may need our business? So in order to design an effective CRM, you need to understand what data will be managed by it, what details each piece of content needs to include, how your users are currently managing it, and what metrics and reports will make that data actionable. And then we have our friend CRUD back again. So we have our CRUD system that we need to pay attention to. So being able to create, for example, our client, be able to read their information, be able to update it, and perhaps even be able to delete it or archive it. And then we have our user roles, again, similar to CMS. So we need to be able to be mindful of who is going to be able to interact with this data. Is it a business executive who may just want to have read access so they can view the data and analytics? Is it somebody that's troubleshooting who may need to go in and edit and delete certain information? So, and that goes for any type of designs that you're working on. Again, really thinking through who your users are going to be and what role will they be playing. Okay, so any questions about designing a CRM? Okay. Awesome. All right. So that pretty much wraps up our discussion around CMS and CRMs. And let's move over to talk about how do we design for mobile applications. So designing for mobile apps is probably one of the most enjoyable things I did as a UX designer. And when we're talking about mobile apps, just as a reminder from yesterday's lesson, we're talking about pieces of software products that are available and can only run on our iPhone or our Android devices. Again, these are apps that are downloadable and they're able to capture functionality that we can use on the go. And so mobile apps tend to be very self-contained units that accomplish specific tasks, and they're also going to have a high degree of interactivity. So again, when it comes to designing any sort of design interface, we need to make sure that we're approaching the same thought process when it comes to designing mobile apps, but there's also a few things that we want to take into consideration. So how do we do that? All right, so I'm going to go through a couple of different items about best practices when it comes to designing mobile apps. And couple of fun facts. So I was reading some statistics. Luke Robleski, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, he had actually put together a really awesome PDF about how users interacted with mobile applications and how to actually keep them engaged. And I will, if we have time at the end, I can go over it, but I'll make sure to share that PDF with you all. It's just really interesting stuff to read. For example, if you think of an average user, he was saying that users typically spend about 3 hours on their mobile device, which is a lot of time. I've heard other facts or other numbers where maybe it's even 5 hours. So when it comes to designing mobile applications, we really need to be mindful that these are products that people, if they find useful, will be interacting with a lot. And another metric that he mentioned in his research article is that there is a 25% abandon rate after a user uses an app for the first time. So think about, a product app that you will be designing. 1 out of 4 may find that it's not going to be useful and may never open it up again. So that first time impression is going to be super critical and very important as we think about designing for mobile applications. Okay, so the first thing that we definitely should be mindful of is we want to make sure that we're prioritizing our features. And we know that our screen sizes are pretty small. They're not going to be as large in comparison to our websites that we view on our desktop. So there's definitely a limited amount of screen real estate. So what you really want to do in this case is you really want to make sure that you have a strong understanding of the purpose of your application. Talk to your stakeholders, understand what the goal of your features should be. Think about all of the research that you've done so far. How is your app going to compare to competitors that you've seen? Also, you may get a project brief. Hopefully you will get one where they might have an outline of all the features that they would like for you to include in this application. But you want to make sure that you're not overwhelming your user, that you're not putting in every single feature. So make sure you're really having that conversation with your stakeholders, find out if everything is necessary. And then if not, talk about, what are some top 2 to 3 features that you may be able to highlight in your mobile application. So any questions about prioritizing features?
I had a question about prioritizing the features. I was wondering when you said like to try to minimize overwhelming the user. What if your stakeholders were really adamant about certain features to be added, but there's just, Like, let's say there's like, they want 10 things like on the landing part, and then you're like, there's not enough space. And then do you just kind of, in those situations, do you just show through testing, like which features are more of a priority, or how do you go about that?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and that's something that I think every designer runs into at some point in their life. So there's a couple of different approaches to that. Personally, for me, what I've found useful is, like you mentioned, my like referring back to the research and talking about what the users found helpful. But then also, it's if they're really, really adamant, you could just present them with two different options. You could present them with what you think will best align your users' goals. And then you could kind of create that worst case scenario where they wanted to have all 10 of those features and have them, create a prototype and have them try it out. It doesn't need to be something super high fidelity. It can just be a wireframe. And that way, when they experience it, they might find that they may not need everything. So actually having them try out the experience is another way to show how to provide them of a way to decrease the amount of features that will appear on that phone. Now, that's not to say that you might win every single battle. There may be times where it's something that they want and you have to add in. But as long as you are putting on your design hat and making sure that you're sharing your reasons why, and relating it back to the users, I mean, that's the best that you can do if you have somebody that is just very much like, I want everything in here. It's definitely a balance act between addressing your users' needs and your business needs. It comes with practice too. It definitely does. So don't let that worry you. Like, you'll find your pitch over time and be like, well, this is something that I've dealt with before and the strategies work. So it comes with time. Great. All right, let's move over to the next piece. Clear navigation. So we want to make sure when we're designing an interface that our users are able to find the content and the features that they're looking for. And we want to make sure that we're providing a clear path for them. So we really need to make sure that we're prioritizing our navigation space, because obviously we're not going to have enough real estate in order to add all of those links in. And when it comes to designing a clear navigation for mobile apps, we can follow the navigation guidelines from Apple or Google, so that we're really maintaining that level of external consistency and making sure that our apps have a usable navigation. And in a little bit, we'll dive into Apple and Google's design documentation. But I just wanted to be able to point that out here. So what questions do we have about clear navigations? Awesome. All right. Third piece, let's make sure that we're designing for our fingers. Our fingers are going to be our primary means of input when we're interacting with a mobile application. And we talked a little bit about this. We can't be as precise with our fingers in comparison to a mouse cursor, only because they're larger. So we want to make sure that when we're creating buttons or we're creating any sort of clickable element, that it's going to be large enough so that when selected, the user doesn't accidentally select something else. And I'm just going to show you something that I was able to pull from UX Mag that should help with touch sizes. But a standard rule of thumb is to have it between 7 to 10 millimeters. And so what does that mean? And so I really love this illustration here. We have right now this person's finger is at 10 millimeters, but then we have a keypad, and then we also have a dime. So dime is at 18 millimeters. So if you ever really wanted to try to figure out what exactly 7 to 10 millimeters is, this is a really awesome reference. Just take a dime and you'll be able to measure it from that. Another recommendation that I have is just continue to test out your devices using your Envision prototype. Make sure that it's on your phone. I used to test my prototypes using my index finger until I had a peer who had really, really big fingers, and he's like, don't test with your index finger. He's like, you should just test with your thumb instead. And I was like, oh, like that makes perfect sense. So maybe you want to go ahead and try with your thumb to see if those touch points are tappable. And then I think I've mentioned this tool before, but we haven't necessarily gone into it. But if you do use Sketch Mirror, that is an awesome way to just quickly screen share what you're building in Sketch, and you'll be able to see if those touch points are also set up in a way where it's easily tappable. So what questions do we have about designing for fingerprints? Okay, questions in Slido. Do you recommend using symbols and nav to facilitate understanding? It depends. If I were to use symbols, I would lean towards the symbols or icons that are used in either iOS or material design, because that's something that's going to be familiar to a user. If you decide to create something else, and I think when you mean symbols, I'm hoping you mean icons. If you decide to use a different type of icon, for example, in the, we're going to go over a tabbed bar, but that if you think of Uber, they have the information on the bottom where you can tab between screens. And let's say you're using iconography for that, you want to make sure that you're testing it, because what one image could mean to someone else could be completely different to somebody else. So just be careful with it. Use what's already provided by Apple or Google, but if you want to create something different, just make sure you're testing it. And then the other question for CMS and CRM, would these be sidebar navigations or like a nav bar? It could be a combination of both, depending on how you set up your tool. You could have a navigation on the top, or you could have a navigation bar on the side. I think it's going to depend how many features and how many things you have. If it's going to be pretty extensive, I could see it more so being a navigation sidebar, so that you can view all the information on the left-hand side, and that it's going to be a little bit more accessible. Okay. All right, so let us go ahead and take our 5-minute break. I will see you back in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. All right. So we just got done talking about designing for fingers. And there was a question, Slido, what do we do in regards to spacing elements? Do we have to take that into consideration? Absolutely. Just like we're taking spacing considerations into our desktop or our websites, we need to be mindful of that in our mobile apps. And later today, we'll dive into iOS's style guide, and we can see that they've already defined some of the spacing there. So that might make our lives a little bit easier in order to incorporate spacing. But if, for example, your style guide is not exactly iOS's or Material Design's template, you will need to make sure that as you're designing your screen, that there is enough spacing just for legibility and readability, and that there's also enough spacing for the buttons that you're designing so that there's enough space for that button to be pressed. All right, so let's move on to the next piece, text hierarchy. So we want to make sure that when we're writing out our text in our mobile applications, when we're designing for it, we want to make sure that it's readable and that we're not straining our eyes to see what it says. And so here, a bullet point that I have here is that we should avoid text that is smaller than 11 points. I would say maybe that's a little too small. I would say maybe even 13 is probably where you want to meet when you're writing really small text. Even 13 in itself is pretty small. So try it out. Try it out in your prototype. Try it out in Sketch Mirror and see how it looks. Even get other people to read it as well. Perhaps maybe those who have really poor vision, they could give you a good sense if that point size is big enough. But overall, we want to make sure that there's enough color contrast, which is something that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. And we really want to make sure that the users are able to consume our content. So again, it's always a best practice to testing out your mobile interfaces live so that you get a sense of what it looks like. But when it comes to using a style guide from iOS and Material Design, iOS has their typeface set up so that it should be pretty legible no matter if it's a design on a desktop versus a design on mobile. And the same with Material Design. They use Roboto, so that's a pretty safe font, a pretty safe typeface to use, whether using a bigger screen or a smaller screen. So what questions do we have about text hierarchy? Okay. Okay, awesome. So I see a lot of navigation questions coming through. So we have a question about other types of navigation, for example, breadcrumbs. So breadcrumbs, if you're not familiar with them, are just links that will lead you back to, well, they're links that will show you where you are on a specific page. So yes, breadcrumbs are going to be a type of navigation that we can present to users so that they don't feel lost and they know where they are. And are there typical elements we should include on a nav bar, especially given the limited space on mobile? Yeah, these are good questions. So your first question about navigation, what I'll do is the different types. Let me put a placeholder in that, and then on Friday, maybe I'll just do like a quick little prezo, so that way we're all familiar with the different types of navigation. especially if that's a question that's coming up. So let me just jot that down. And then the second question, typical elements on a nav bar, it's going to vary. So if we look at a mobile device, typically on a nav bar, it's going to be in context of the screen. So maybe on the home page, you'll have a title. Maybe you'll have some people place settings. Maybe if you're in another layer within the app, perhaps there's a back button. And we can take a look at some of those pieces and see what they look like. But it's going to be very contextual to the type of content that person is viewing. And now if we're looking at a website, that is going to be a little bit different just because we have more real estate. So that nav bar's content is going to be driven by features that customers are likely going to want to use. Or perhaps maybe there's typically like a sign in, sign up button. So I wouldn't say there's like a set of links that have to be there. It's going to vary. It's going to be very contextual to the product that you're creating. But we can take a look at some of those examples in the mobile app interfaces when we get there in a bit. Good questions. All right, so we've just talked about text hierarchy. Let's move on to avoiding unnecessary inputs. Okay, we talked a little bit about this yesterday when we were talking about form design, good form design. So what we mean by avoiding unnecessary inputs is that when it comes to a user filling out a form, it may not be very easy to do so on a small screen size. So when we're designing forms, we want to make sure that they're as concise as possible. And so an example of this could be, let's say you were requesting to have them enter in perhaps an age range. Instead of them entering it in manually, perhaps consider putting it as a drop-down menu so that the user could easily go in and select the age range that they're in. So just really thinking of shortcuts so that we can make it easier for our user to navigate. The worst thing we want to do is provide a super long form in a mobile device and then have the user attempt to try to fill it out, and then they give up because it's just too cumbersome and there's just too much information and there's too much typing. So what questions do we have about avoiding unnecessary inputs? Okay. And then the last one we'll go over is delaying asking for permissions. And this happens in iOS devices and Android devices. And what I mean by permissions is if you've ever downloaded an app, for example, if you've downloaded Instagram or some sort of social media app, you may get pop-ups that appear or modals that appear requesting to access your location or requesting to access your camera or your microphone and whatever features that this app needs in order to perform. So a really good practice when designing for permissions is keeping it contextual. So you really don't want to have a user go in and download your app and then present them with a ton of these modals requesting them to grant permission. That's a really poor experience for a couple of reasons. One, I may have just downloaded your app for the first time and I really don't understand. I may not understand what the value of it is yet. So to bombard me with all these questions and information requesting me to grant permission, I may not understand why you're asking for it. I may be wondering why are you asking for so many different permissions that I may just get turned off and actually just uninstall the application. So in order to make sure that we're designing for permissions correctly or in a better way, we want to keep it contextual so that if, for example, let's say I'm designing for Instagram, if I'm about to tap on the camera button, then that's an opportunity for me to present the camera permission option so that I am more likely to say, okay, yes, like I totally understand what this permission is for because I'm about to use this camera picture to take this camera feature to take a picture of my niece. So keeping it contextual is going to be helpful and really help the user understand why those permissions are helpful. So what questions do we have about delaying to ask for permissions? How are the types of permissions determined? Is it by legal team stakeholders? That is a good question. That is a conversation that you're actually going to have with your developers. So when they're designing, when they're developing and coding the application, depending on whether they're coding in iOS or for Android, they will already have a set of permissions determined by a specific operating system. And so Android, for example, they have a list of permissions that they always request from users. They will always request location permissions. They'll request camera, microphone. There may be a few others that don't come to mind, but these have already been set by Android or by iOS. So it's not going to come from your legal team stakeholders. Now, on the other hand, what may come from your legal team stakeholders is probably the language that you use. So you may not be able to get rid of those permissions. Those are something that you are going to have in your app. But the way that you present it, the copy that you're using, you'll have the ability to customize that. So you may need to run that by legal just to make sure that it makes sense. I dealt a lot with permissions when I was designing, so if there's any other questions to that, I'm happy to answer it. Okay. All right, so before we move on to Apple and Google's guidelines, there's just a few other things I wanted to point out when it comes to designing for mobile apps that are not necessarily on this slide right now. But when it comes to mobile apps, we really want to make sure that we're testing our designs. Our designs are a constant iteration. What we create is not going to be perfect. We're always going to continually trying to improve it, whether it's based on customer feedback or whether we're trying to implement new features. You always want to make sure that you're also engaging your stakeholders to make sure that you're getting feedback, that you're collaborating with your developers so that you're both on the same page and that what you're designing for is feasible. And regarding testing, an easy way to test if you don't have like a formal user test set up is you could do something called hallway testing. You could literally just walk up to another designer or someone who sits on the same floor as you and just say, hey, tell me what you think you can do with this application. They'll walk you through, and then immediately you'll already start to gauge like what's working and what's not working. So just a few things to keep in mind in that realm. Okay, so let's talk about Apple and Google. All right, I am going to just bring up, actually before I bring this up, let me just talk about this and then I'll bring up the guidelines. So related to Apple's human interface guidelines, they have very specific application patterns that you've seen if you are an iPhone user. But what they also do is they provide additional guidance about their design principles so that if you were to create an iOS application, that all of these apps in the App Store is going to deliver a consistent user experience. And when you're designing for an iOS app, Apple is very, very much in tune of making sure that they're providing the highest quality of applications on its mobile platform, because they're trying to maintain that level, that reputation for quality. And so if you ever work on an iOS product, even if you're doing some sort of marketing for Apple, maybe you're designing an application, everything that you've designed, you're going to actually have to run that by Apple in order to get approval to launch it. So they're very strict, and they, again, really want to make sure that they're maintaining that level of that consistent experience, and that they're maintaining their brand identity in that way. So as you start designing the iOS experiences, just make sure that you're paying attention to the design guidelines that are listed, which we will take a look at. And then that way you can really make sure that you're designing an experience that users will be familiar with. And so an example of a UI component that Apple uses is this tab bar, which we were talking about earlier. And so this tab bar is going to allow users to be able to switch between different sections of the applications. And again, this is also a very common UI pattern. So thinking through maintaining that external consistency, we wouldn't really want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to a tabbed bar. We would want to make it somewhat consistent to what we see here. For example, if we were a UX designer for Uber, we may use this guideline as a starting point, but then we may add some additional pieces or additional functionality just to make it feel more like Uber. So that is to say that when you're creating or designing an application, you have to make sure that you're familiar with the guidelines. And then as you sort of come up with your own solutions, that is going to come with time. That's going to come with practice. That's a combination of being familiar with what these patterns are and then kind of exploring to see what minor adjustments you can make to change it. So that's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that you'll be able to practice and learn over time. So another example is, let's say you're designing an application to share images, then we'd most likely need some sort of navigation and a way to view our images. With our components in mind, we can review the documentation and figure out the common navigation and image presentation patterns. If we reviewed the guidelines and there wasn't any guidance, then we could start coming up with our own solution. So let's take a look at Apple's guidelines. And I'll share the link if you want to take a look while we go through this together. All right. This is a really wonderful resource, not only because you'll get familiar with Apple's components, but it also does a really nice job just trying to explain how certain interactions should take place. And similar to when we were reviewing the Bootstrap components last week, iOS is going to have their own set of components that they use. And they're also going to have their own type of language that they use, so that if you're talking to an iOS developer, you want to make sure that you're using the same language and that you're not calling it something differently, so that way it's just understandable and you have that common shared language. So I'm just going to scroll down over to Interface Essentials. And basically the way that Apple is set up in terms of their UI is that they focus on 3 different pieces. They have something called bars, which are going to provide context to the user and where they are in the application. And then they have views, which is going to be the primary content that people see. And then they're going to have something called controls. So think of things like buttons, where users are able to initiate actions. And although we won't be able to go over every single little piece of detail, only because I want to make sure that I can show you an example of how we could use a style guide this design system in order to create a mobile app, feel free to take a look at it in your spare time. But we can run through some of these pieces that we talked about here. So we have bars. Let's look at navigation bars, because that's a question that came up. So this is an example of a navigation bar that Apple uses. And it looks a little bit different than what we've seen on our desktop. Again, this is more relatable to a calendar view. So the navigation bar is going to look different, where the user is able to go back, or the user is able to see what month they're in. And there's also additional buttons that they can use, additional actions that they can use within this calendar view. And then we have other different types of navigation bars in iOS. So in this example, this is someone's inbox. So thinking through what are those main features that would appear to that user, we would need some sort of back button, especially if we're in a deeper layer within the app. And then for inbox, they have, I think in their mind, they have this edit functionality, which seems like something that users are looking to incorporate or use. And of course, depending on the type of device you're using, this is more of like an older version, an older style, but this is something with our newer iPhone devices that we see, just a different visual representation of what the nav bar could look like. And then we talked a little bit about tab bars. Let's see if there's something else. Status bars, that's also something to take into consideration when you're designing for mobile. And so let's move over to views. So views, there's a whole list of components. Again, we won't be able to go over every single one. So, after your assignment, if there's some extra time, take a look at this, but everything has a specific name to it. So we have something called action sheets, which you've probably seen. In this case, if you're trying to provide a list of options, this is called an action sheet. We have something called alerts. So in this case, if there were some type of permission that was showing up, that would be called an alert. This is actually going to be more so for tablets, but there is a split view layout. And then if we move over to controls, we have our buttons. We have our labels. So this is also keeping in mind our text hierarchy. Progress indicators, so our loading, our spinners that we were looking at in Bootstrap. And the list goes on and on. So what questions do we have about the human interface guidelines?
Did you use these a lot, or was it more just like a starting point?
That's a good question. I used these a lot. So when I was designing an iOS application, it was taking into consideration how these interactions worked, but there may have been a slight variance to it, where it didn't exactly look like what was presented here. It's kind of hard to actually talk about it verbally without showing you. But there are certain components that I customized, that I tweaked just a little bit. And I can show an example when we get into Sketch. But typically the interaction followed these guidelines that we have here. And I mean, we really made sure that we focused on these guidelines, only because we didn't want our user to be confused when they were using our application. We didn't want to add in new new gestures or interactions that didn't quite make sense or that wouldn't be familiar with them. So this was our way of keeping that familiarity. What is the difference between iOS and Android applications? Does each format have its own style guide? Yes, they do. They're going to be very different from one another. So, excuse me. Let's actually dive over to material design and we can take a look at the difference between the two. Okay. Just give me one moment.
Melissa, this may have been covered already, but does Sketch have a plugin for material design so that you can download the material design templates?
There is, yes. There is a plugin that Google has made available that you can use. I haven't installed, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. There may be other plugins that are available, but what I've done is I've just used Sketch's built-in material design library, and I'm able to create designs through there. But let me get back to you on the plugin because I can't remember the name that I'm using off the top of my head.
The reason I ask is because they typically seem to do updates. And through the plugins, I think you can get updates faster than the built-in.
Mm-hmm. That is a really, really good point. Yes. So I like that you brought that up. Their material design and the human interface guidelines, they're updating. I think material design does a little bit more in terms of their updating, but in any case, you want to make sure that you're staying relevant to what they are what they're updating. So, for example, they're for Google, they have Google I/O. Google I/O is a great way to not only find out what types of new devices that they'll be launching, but there's also a way for them to be able to stay up to date on the design styles. So, Alan, thank you for bringing that up. Okay. All right, so material design. So material design is going to be much different than what you see with Apple's design. And so Google in their documentation explains material design is a visual language that synthesizes the classic principles of good design with the innovation of technology and science. So with Google's own design system, they could actually be used on the web or for apps or any other sort of platform. And if you've ever used Gmail or any other Google product, you've already seen material design in action, or maybe you have an Android device too. So let's move on over to what are some of the components that you may see in material design. So this is an example of a tab bar. So this one actually looks pretty new, but and that just goes to show that they're constantly updating their design style guide. But the tab bar is going to be a common UI pattern that that folks use in their Android applications. And so again, we want to make sure that we stay up to date on material design, on iOS design. So let's actually move over to material design. Nope, that's not it. Here we go. Okay, so let me share this with you all in the channel. Okay, so that you can follow along. So material design is going to be a little bit different. You could see that they really play into flat design here. And they also have a lot of emphasis on motion design. So if you see some of the applications, there's a lot of different transitions that they have built. And we talked a little bit earlier about sound design. So sound design is something new if you want to explore it. It is located here. I haven't taken a close look at it, but these are some of the things that are going to separate material design from iOS design. And let's look at navigation. So you can see here, they do a really nice job with their animations, just presenting content. So this is another example of motion design that they have here. So these are some of the transitions that you might need to, that you'll have to be mindful of as you're designing out an Android application. I was trying to see if there was an example of an actual navigation that I could, oh, I think this is, okay, sorry. They're just talking about the navigation from screen to screen. But if you continue here, what I also really love about their design style guide is that they show examples too. And we looked at an example in our assignment as part of our stretch goal earlier this week. So if you ever really want to try to get really good at transitions, just take a look at the examples here and actually try to build it out. But in terms of the components, I'm trying to think where they're located. Here we go. Components. All right, awesome. So if you go into components, they are all going to have its own name, similar to Apple. So Apple is going to have something called an app bar. So they have their top app bar and they have their bottom app bar. So it's not necessarily called a navigation, but it is a navigation bar. And so again, this content is going to be different depending on what we're displaying to the user. And then what else? We have buttons that are going to look like a couple of different things here. So we have our buttons that are filled, outlined. They also have buttons that are text only, similar to iOS. What else? They have snack bars. I think we were talking about snack bars earlier. So they're going to be those quick pieces of information that are going to appear. And this will typically appear at the end of a screen. So here we have somebody who has added, looks like, some sort of label. And this is more like a confirmation that appears. Okay, so what questions do we have about material design? All right, so let's actually demo this out. I think I did a really, really small demo with material design last week. So let's talk about how we would go ahead and build out an iOS mobile application. And let's see how quickly I can do this, because I want to make sure that we don't go over in time here. So what I have right here is actually the iOS 12 GUI sketch file that I sent out to you all earlier, if you want to go ahead and take a look at that. And just as a heads up, it did already come with a bunch of symbols that I could refer back to in order to make my design a higher fidelity. But just for the sake of time, I just pulled out a couple of different pieces and just made my own little design library here, just because it was going to be easier for my work process. So in case you're wondering why you see UX4 as a title, that's just something that I've done on my own. And let's go ahead and create a mobile app. And let's say that we're creating some type of workout app. So again, we want to make sure that we have defined our content. So with our workout app, there's going to be some type of daily plan. We'll have a list of workouts. We'll have a meal plan. And maybe we'll have some sort of settings if we can get to that with profile details. So what I would do in this case is, let's actually start with a lower fidelity screen. So I'm going to go ahead, select Apple device as my artboard. I'm going to use the iPhone 8, and I'm going to go ahead and create my home page. So keeping in mind some of the general guidelines in Apple, perhaps maybe there's some sort of status bar that pops up here. Obviously, we would want some type of navigation bar. Maybe I'll have a title, keep it very simple, called workout. And I'm not going to worry so much. Well, let me fix that. All right, great. So I have my title. And then maybe because it's a daily plan, I'm going to have what I'm supposed to do today in terms of my workout. So maybe I will have a card that will be dedicated to what my workout is. So maybe I'm swimming, swim, 25 laps. Maybe I'll have some sort of card that tells me what I should be eating today. So chicken, salad, and then maybe I'll have, what else? Maybe I'll want some sort of tab bar so that I can view my workout and my settings. So maybe I'll have some sort of iconography, but for now, I'm just going to go ahead and create 2 sections. So I have my workouts.
What size pool are we talking about here?
What size pool? I'm open to ideas. We're talking about kiddie pool or Olympic size pool. Olympic size would be wonderful. Meals or settings. All right, so I'm keeping this super, super basic. And so obviously, because it's a wireframe, maybe I'll just go ahead and just adjust some of the font sizes here. So then maybe there is some additional information, like if I swim 25 laps, what is that? Let's just say 500 calories. And then maybe if I eat a chicken salad, that's going to be, who knows, 800 calories. So it's probably a lot of stuff in there. Anyways, okay, so I have my tab, so I can go through my workouts and my settings. I have my workouts listed here. And there could be other things that are listed here too. Like I said, my status bar, maybe there's more information, but we're just prioritizing our features right now. We're not worried about putting too much information. And so let's say we were good to go with this lower fidelity screen. How would we go ahead and make it higher fidelity? So obviously you've done your testing, you've prioritized your features. This is a format that seems to be working from an interaction perspective that users really get. And obviously there would be more screens, but for today's demo, we'll just focus on one screen right now. So just to show a before and after, we're gonna move this over to higher fidelity using our style guide. And when you work in a style guide like this, you can actually, rather than designing right within the sketch document, you can actually add it as a library. So when you add it as a library, oops, oh no, things are freezing. Oh, here we go. Great. So when you add it as a library, what happens is you'll see that this will appear here. So I've actually added the wrong thing. I've added this specific page, but what I really wanted to add was the symbols page that I've created. So when you go ahead and do that, you're actually able to open up a brand new sketch file. And when you go into file, when you go into insert symbol, you'll see Apple iOS UI as a library that you can pull from. So you don't always need to import and export your symbols library because it can get pretty big. You'll just be able to add its library and be able to pull the components here. So play around with that if you get a chance. That's just a shortcut I want to make sure that you're all familiar with. So let's start working on our high fidelity screen. All right, so we need some sort of status bar. So I'm just gonna go into symbols. Again, I created my own library just to be able to speed up things. So I'm gonna go in and add my status bar. Now I wanna be able to add some sort of navigation here to to let the user know what app that they're viewing. So go back into my symbols. Let's add in my navigation. And it's hiding my status. And so I've added in my navigation. Right now it's currently called settings, but because it's a symbol, I can go ahead and rename it to workout. And then what else? We're gonna need some sort of bar on the bottom. So let's go back into our library and pull out our navigation, our tapped bar. So we can add this in the bottom. And we can name this workout. And I know right now there's 3 things. So I'm just gonna go ahead and detach it from the symbol and just get rid of this guy here. Double clicking will bring you back to the symbols list. All right, so then I have settings.
The text isn't going to be too small in the end to read?
It's very small. I'm happy that you pointed that out. Yes, so use your best judgment. This is 10, and I don't recommend using 10. So this is an instance where I would probably go in and just modify it because, like, to me, that font is super tiny. If I put it in preview mode, Command P, like that's just super, super small. And I'm sure it even looks a little crazier if I were to preview it on my phone. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, I can always adjust the library that I'm working on and just make that font size bigger. So let's try 14. And that seems to be much better. And obviously I would want to test it. Good call out, Gabe. All right, so now that I have my bottom navigation, let's go ahead and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger just because I know I'll probably add some iconography here. And what else? We want to be able to add these cards. So if we go back in here and add a card, we could add this guy here. And so maybe it's something like this where my workout is a bunch of cards. I can go in and change my header to swim 25 laps. And then maybe my supporting text could be the calorie count. And then I want to add my meal plan. So here, again, just changing that to chicken salad and changing the text, the subtitle text to 800 calories. And this is how I would sort of start building out what my design could look like. And so as I continue to start building it out, it's going to feel more and more like an iOS application because of the style guide that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is actually, let me just detach it because this line should be all the way at the end. So now I have my cards, and I'm sure there's more content that we can add in here, but just for having something super simple right now, I've already built out what this design could look like in terms of an iOS application. So what questions do we have about any of the process that I've just demonstrated?
I have a more general question.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm iOS, like a Mac user and iPhone user, it comes much more naturally, like understanding the layout and the style guide for iOS. Have you found it's been easier or harder to like do Android or iOS applications based on like what you use and what's your natural instinct?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. That is a really good point. So I'm an Android user, but I had an iPhone as my work phone. And so when it came to designing Android, I was already familiar with it. And it was also nice because I actually had a live product. If I like couldn't remember a certain interaction, I would just go in and test it out and be like, oh, this is how a person should be able to use it. But for iPhones, for some reason, I just get really frustrated when I use it. And because I'm not using it as a product, I I always have to refer back to the guidelines, or maybe I'll just use somebody else's phone who has an iPhone in order to get familiar with it. So that's definitely something that happens. There's a question in Slido. It says, what are widgets? So I don't know if that is in reference to tonight's assignment because we're using the word widgets, or we're talking about widgets from an application standpoint. From an application standpoint, I know widgets are something that's available in Android devices where it provides live information. So for example, on my home screen, I can place a weather widget so that it automatically updates in real time what the weather is. So that's an example of a widget. And then we'll go over the assignment on what a widget is, so that way everyone is clear on that. What else can I help answer?
Lisa, just because the high fidelity is like from the components, the iOS components, it's called high fidelity because I don't know. I thought they had to have some color or images.
Yeah. Good question. So it this probably could get updated with images. So this is probably still low fidelity. But some of the stuff that we have here is going to be considered higher fidelity just because we're using this kit that we have here. So it may not contain a lot of color, but because we're using the same components, I'm going to consider as higher fidelity. So if you look at this example here, this is a setting screen. It's very plain. There's not a lot of color. There's not any sort of imagery, but this will still be high fidelity. So you'll see that some designers, they're so well versed in iOS design that sometimes they may not even create a low fidelity screen. They might actually just start creating using the components. I would just stay away from that until you get really comfortable. I would always just stick with lower fidelity first before we start moving into designing with these style guide libraries that we see here. What else? Great. So let's look at tonight's assignment together. All right. So congratulations, you've just been hired as a UX designer by Widgets Global. As you may have surmised, Widgets Global is in the business of selling widgets to its global clientele. So when we talk about widgets here, widgets is just think of it as a generic name for products. That's what we're referring to here. It's just going to be whatever products that Widgets Global is selling to its clients.
Thingamajigs.
Yes. Yes, Nathan. Thank you. So for your first project, they'd like for you to help them redesign their CRM and CMS systems. Currently, their CRM and CMS are combined in the same web app, and they would like you to keep them together so that you can do they can do all of their work in the same place. So you will be creating a web application. Do not create a mobile app. It's going to be a web application. And then for your assignment, make sure that you're starting off by designing a low fidelity hybrid of a CMS and CRM web app. This is going to include the following: a navigation, which is going to include links for clients, widgets, or products, and the currently logged in user's profile. A clients page, this should include a listing of 6 widgets global clients. So if we think back to Salesforce, there was a page with all of the different accounts. A client page, this should show the details for one client. The details should include the client's name, address, and all of the widgets that they've purchased. Again, thinking back to Salesforce, when we clicked into a specific account, we were able to pull that information. And then we have a widgets page, your products page. This should include a listing of the 3 widgets in Widgets Global Inventory. And you don't need to go crazy with this. You could literally just have a page that says widget 1, widget 2, and widget 3. So once you've completed your designs, upload them into InVision and connect the pages with hotspots. And make sure that you share this link in your daily stand-up form. And then as a stretch goal, make sure that if you have time, increase the fidelity of your designs to incorporate color and other design elements. And again, we'll be checking InVision history setting to make sure that you've completed and uploaded the low fidelity designs before starting on the high fidelity designs. And then as a super stretch goal for those, if you do finish this assignment, take a look at the different pattern libraries and come up and start playing around with it and coming up with some sort of design from that. All right, so what questions do we have about tonight's assignment?
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. We're not necessarily expected to do the little elements at the top and import the library like you did in the demo just now. It's literally just the wireframing and hotspots.
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to be working on a web application. So what I just demonstrated was creating a native mobile application. So you will not be using any of those components. Just like the assignments that you were developing earlier this week and previous weeks, you're going to focus on those components. Anything else? Okay, show of thumbs. How is everyone feeling for today's lesson? Okay, great. All right, awesome. Well, enjoy lunch and I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.